Some more research that has been inspired by the cognitive approach. We're going to start here with priming studies. And priming, remember, is the concept of bringing something to mind. So we can prime you, for instance, to think about anything. We can prime you to think about coffee, right? And see how that affects your cognitive processes. So that's what priming studies are. We purposely prime people certain schemas in their mind. Okay? And when we say schema, we're talking about a general knowledge construct. A general knowledge construct. So for instance, you have a schema for weddings. You have a schema for weddings. You can think about weddings as being the central node, but there are a lot of other nodes attached to it, a lot of other information. For instance, what does the bride wear? What do people typically eat at weddings? What do the bride and groom exchange? And so on, right? There are a lot of nodes that are attached to that central node. And so that entire construct, all those nodes, would be called a schema, in this case a schema for a wedding. I want you to pause here and I want you to answer a review question. What was George Kelly's fundamental postulate? Pause the video a minute and see if you can bring that to mind and then come back and compare your answer. So the answer to that, his fundamental postulate was that people experience the world. They see it, they view it through and experience it through the lens of their personal constructs. So personal constructs are like huge schemas, right? Now we're talking about the same idea. It really affects everything in your cognitive processes. So not just how you interpret the world, but what you pay attention to, what you tend to remember, so on and so forth. Okay? So schemas affect many cognitive processes. And the studies showing this, the typical methodology is that first we prime somebody, we prime two different groups, okay, for two different schemas. And then we give them something to test their attention or test their interpretation or test their memory and see how it affects those processes differently. So the example I'm going to give you is a really cool study here that was done. So participants, remember the first task is to prime them with something. Participants were divided randomly into two groups. And the first group got this word completion task. And we wanted it to be very, very simple. And you also want it to make sure that everybody gets the right answer. So with each of these, we gave them a cue before they answered it. And the first one was, what do you do at night? What do you do? Hopefully you said dream, right? And the second one is, your cue is life and hopefully you said death. And the third one is something you wear on your wrist, and the answer to that one is watch. So what we're interested in here is this middle one, right? Death. Priming the death construct. The second group also got the same word completion task, and by the way, it was much longer than this. Death was in the middle, which makes it even more impressive that it would have an effect, right? And same with the other group. Theirs was also very long, and it was identical except for that middle word. This time with this group was something you look into, and hopefully you answered that with mirror. Okay. Now, both groups were told they were going to see a picture very briefly, so I'm going to flash it to you very briefly like it was to them, and they were supposed to report what they saw. And this is the picture they saw. Much shorter than that, so I got stuck on it a little bit longer. But anyway, they were flashed it much shorter than that. Anyway, who do you think was much more likely to report a skeleton or a skull? The head of a skeleton or a skull? The group that was primed with death. And the other group was much more likely to report that they had seen a woman grooming in front of a mirror. Okay. So schemas, what happens to be on your mind at the time, can really affect your cognitive processes. So in this particular study, the the schema that was primed affected which of these cognitive processes? Which of them listed on the slide? And the answer to that is interpretation. Yes. Now, let me show you one example of where the schema research went to, and that is identifying the depressive schema. So people who are clinically depressed, this depressive schema really affects their cognitive processes. For instance, they show selective attention to negative information. So it affects what they pay attention to. They show negative interpretation of ambiguous information. So let's say that we were having a live class, and I said, Chris, come see me after class. Okay? And if we had a student named Chris in the class who was depressed, okay, Chris would be much more likely to think I was going to say something negative to him, bring something negative to his attention. And in fact, that was a perfectly ambiguous statement. You know, I might have really wanted to compliment him, for instance, on his assessment assignment, the job he did on that. And people who are depressed tend to show enhanced memory for negative experiences and other negative things in life. And so you can give them a simple word test, positive and negative words. And as long as the words aren't too negative, they show much more memory for the negative words compared to the positive than we see in the rest of the population. Now notice that I said if the words weren't too negative, because there are some very strong negative words, like cancer would be an example that everybody tends to remember, because we were built, evolutionarily speaking, to pay attention to those kinds of words that pose a threat for us. Okay. And this is also a great way to test the effects of cognitive therapy, is they can use this little cognitive test before and after with depressed clients. So once they figure out that somebody is depressed, early on in their therapy, they can give them this simple positive and negative word list, and then a little later test their memory and see this advantage for negative memory. But do it again when down the road the client and the therapist both agree that this person can afford therapy, they are ready, and test them again with the same positive and negative word list and see if they are now much closer to the general population in the balance of what positive and negative information they tend to remember. So a great little test there of the effect of cognitive therapy for somebody. Okay. Let's look at this really cool cognitive technique that the cognitive theorists have come up with for helping people to break an addiction. So first off, what we want to do is talk about the frontal lobe of the brain. Okay, so the frontal lobe of the brain is involved in executive functions. Okay, and when we say executive functions, you know, we're really talking about higher level decision making at the higher level that really benefits from things like foresight, right? Impulse control, that kind of thing. And so this is why these are called executive functions. I want you to think about this. You know, this is the decision-making function. So if you think about, for instance, a factory, you've got people working on the floors that really aren't concerned with higher level decision-making. They're just doing the jobs that are assigned to them, right? But you have executives sitting in seats at higher levels that are making very important decisions. And so that kind of executive functioning, important decisions, is, you know, that process is located in the frontal lobe. And it includes impulse control and decision making and foresight and such. Okay. The cognitive theorists have found a correlation, a significant correlation between executive functioning abilities, okay, and the tendency to have an addiction. And it's an inverse relationship, meaning it's a negative relationship, right? So the higher the executive functioning, the less likely the chance of being addicted. But they found something else, that you can increase a big part of executive functioning, which is called working memory, with efficiency training. You can increase it for people. So for many people, this is one extra bonus that can really help them to overcome an addiction, is working memory efficiency training. Very cool stuff.